Jane, Julian here. Hello. It's so good to join with you in conversation about the notion of organisational wisdom. And great to be joining you in what is the first of a series of conversations, brief conversations that we're going to put out about the notion of wisdom, where we're going to draw on all the spheres of leadership, spiritual sphere, philosophical sphere, psychology, etc., literature as well. Because you and I and several others that we are in collaboration with just believe wisdom is right at the core of how we can build and thrive in a better world. And I guess in our conversations, Jane, we're going to have this motif of, you know, what can we ask of ourselves, of our wisdom as individuals, as families, as organisations, as society in this really demanding time. So that's our context, and we'll be putting this out with a blog, and it's so good to be joined by you, Jane. You told me not to call you, so I won't. So Jane Gaukroger. So good to be with you, friend and colleague. And without further ado, please do introduce yourself in any way you like. But my first question really is about your interest in wisdom, and you know, because it's very profound for you and it's been piqued, and I wonder what has piqued it. What has got you really curious about this?
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, Julian. I mean, it's a very good starting question, because in many ways I'm not exactly sure how I would pinpoint the moment when my interest in wisdom was piqued. It's been perhaps a bit of a journey, but if I just sort of share some of the core kind of elements. I've worked, and known you for a long time, worked in organisations for a very long time, really focused on people in organisations and worked in lots of different places. And I suppose I'm just fascinated by them. I mean, they matter greatly. I believe profoundly organisations matter hugely, not only because of the services they give to us, and crikey, we're very aware of that now, aren't we, with the needs we have from our health service and our supermarkets and our food providers. I mean, they're profoundly important, but they're profoundly important to us personally because of how we work in them and the effect that has on our lives. So I suppose, you know, my work has been around that, and I'm fascinated by it. And there's so much good in organisations, and I try and, I suppose, concentrate a lot on that. I try and appreciate what's good, but I'm also interested in what's not so good. And to get to the point on my wisdom journey, I started doing some research, really partly prompted, I would say, around the time of the financial crash, about what was going on in banks and
so 10 years ago. So.
Yeah, so why were things going wrong? And if you think about it, then there's been many other sort of, you might call them scandals and things around things like the phone hacking. I mean, I'm talking from a UK perspective, obviously, but phone hacking, parliamentary expenses. There'd been things like the Mid-Staff's health inquiry about shortcomings in care. And, you know, that's carried on, hasn't it? More recently, we've had things like the Me Too movement. We've had things like the questioning the behaviour of the tech giants and so on. So why is it that some of these big organisations, which seem to be, in many ways, have an infrastructure you would expect to keep us in a good place, don't always do that? So that was what started the inquiry. I mean, again, to sort of try to get to it briefly, I started really reading a lot around ethics and corporate social responsibility. And for some reason, at some point, I started to have a sense that they were a bit narrow in focus, that I was starting to read that, you know, lots of places have ethics committees and they have corporate social responsibility policies, but somehow there was something bigger that was missing. And somewhere along the way, I saw this word wisdom. I saw some people writing about it, and that's when I went off on the journey, and I started reading around it. And perhaps just to summarise, what was interesting was that people started to write about it explicitly in about the 1990s, probably 1990s, I would say. Few people writing, probably mainly from a psychology base, but starting to leak into the organisational literature. Not very much, but then by about the 2000s and by about 2010, suddenly it seemed to be exploding. And I was just really interested in what was going on. Why was that happening in the literature? What was going on? Where was the interest coming from? And yet I wasn't hearing the word wisdom being used in organisations. So that's kind of...
So a sense of explosion and richness of exploration, but where was it in organisational discourse and life?
Yes.
And I know you embarked on so many things in your leadership work, but also did a PhD and really went at it around organisational wisdom.
Yes. Yeah.
So what's emerged for you? What have you learned? What's become really strong for you? I know we've talked about it can defy definition. It might be about interdependence and serving the greater good, but it's defied. There's a mystery about wisdom, isn't there? I'd just love you to talk about what you found and what you framed around it.
Yeah, I mean, at the highest level, of course, and you allude to me doing a doctorate in doing the literature review. Of course, that forced me into asking, how on earth do you define it? And you immediately can go back to the ancients and the definitions and the classical from the Western tradition. I came across this awareness that the word philosophy itself means love of wisdom. So I didn't know that before I started to search. And so, I mean, what I suppose I discovered was, of all the many writings on it, it's not easy to find a single definition that I would attach to. And I often get asked, what's my definition of wisdom? I nearly always, you will have heard me push back and say, not sure that matters. I think it's much more about a search than it is a definition. I think perhaps it's worth saying where I got to. In the research I did, I asked a group of leaders and people working in and with organisations what they thought wisdom was in organisations. And I essentially came to a framework, essentially listening to people, came to a framework which characterised wisdom, which says, there are some characteristics which seem to be present when wisdom's present. And that framework, if I just briefly, it says, explained it has 6 characteristics, and 3 of the characteristics are what you might describe as inner characteristics. They're more about what we know and how we interpret things and how we see the world. And 3 are more outer characteristics. They're more observable in our behaviour. And I should say at this point, I know the working with the inner and the outer, and that is a profound area that you work with, and that I, have enjoyed listening to you talking about. But the three inner characteristics of the framework, the wisdom framework, as I explored it, were consciousness, which is, if you like, our awakeness to ourselves, to each other, to the world. Conscience, which I might describe as our orientation, our purpose, our focus on, I would say, the focus on the common good, on what's good. And then context, which would be our understanding of context, because I do think wisdom is dependent on context. I don't think there's an absolute wisdom. I think it depends. So that understanding. So those 3 inner ones, which are consciousness, conscience, context. And then the 3 outer ones, probably much more observable, which would be collaboration, how we work together, compassion, how we care for each other and more broadly for the world and ourselves, and courage, because I think wisdom and courage are very connected. And it's quite interesting. I think probably one of the most influential books I ever read on the journey was, in fact, connected that principle, organisational principle of wisdom and courage, and I think it is crucial. So that's the sort of characterising wisdom, and it's probably worth saying I see it as very much a united, and I draw my framework as a circle of characteristics, inner and outer. But I also think, when you think about characterising, I also think about, well, who are the characters in organisational wisdom? And I push my framework a bit to say, well, I think the characters can be at many levels. I think it's us as individuals, so our intrapersonal wisdom, our own wisdom. I think it's us in relationship with other people, together, pairs, groups, our interpersonal wisdom. But I think there's also an extra personal, another level, which is the wisdom that's held kind of in the more tangible, functional realm, if you like, which would be in organisations' processes and technology systems, all that sort of stuff. I always try and say you could have lots of really compassionate people, but if the rules and the processes aren't compassionate, you're lacking some wisdom. So there's a connection between the individual, the group, the organisation, and the kind of functional realm. So, I mean, that describes the characterising of it. I don't know if you want me to go further and talk about...
No, I mean, that's incredibly helpful, and there's such a sense of the whole there, isn't there, of connection, inner and outer. I mean, all the words begin with connection, interconnectedness, the whole system, individual, organisation, society, a sense of interconnectedness really running through this notion.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think I may have said to you, whenever I write anything about one of the characteristics, I sort of almost always end up saying, oh, that's the one, and that one, I love that one in particular, and then I find it always takes me into a connection with another one. So, I always feel they are dependent, mutually dependent. And
there's something really strong for me in all of the conversations we've had as well about practice, because you put real emphasis on practice.
Yes.
And Jen, I'd love to invite you to talk about that a little bit. You talk about mind and heart and body, the connection across all three, both in terms of us as human beings, but also organisational systems, and the sense of practice at those levels, again, very interconnected. Might I invite you just to talk a little bit about that and your framing of how to help us think about those things?
Well, I suppose at a practice level, when you pick up particularly on the mind, heart and body, I think when I'm thinking about that sort of consciousness, that awakeness, which we might say is a foundation for wisdom, it seems to me it does depend on us having a sort of balance. And I think that balance of using our our mind, our head, using our observation, our body, our groundedness, our sense of our moving centre, our being part of the world, and also our heart, our connection. And I certainly feel for myself that it's really important to keep those things in balance. And we work together on things, using things as many organisations do, like the Myers-Briggs and other tools. Some of us use the Enneagram, where if we think about it, I do believe we have preferences, natural tendencies. And I think finding our way back into balance is really crucial. So I'm quite a strong advocate that things like Myers-Briggs help us to see where we start from. But actually what we probably grow most in our wisdom is by finding a better balance, rather than saying, that's me, that's how I am, take me or leave me, sort of thing. I don't know if that...
I've heard you talk about, in our own personal journeys, to be thinking about what wisdom means for us, to think about examples, to think about rituals in terms of practice. Could you say a little bit about that? Because I think that's a really helpful notion for us all to think about, to have in our minds.
Yes, I mean, I think I'm using this term cultivating wisdom because, I mean, it's really, I love and could carry on reading about wisdom forever, but in the end, as you said earlier, it's lived, it's embodied. I don't think you can have just theory or just practice, the two intertwine. And my sort of simple framework for thinking about cultivating wisdom, and it's pretty simple, 4 words I use really, which are quest. Are we looking? Are we searching for wisdom? What's our search for wisdom? Exemplars. Well, who's guiding us? What and who do we follow? What guides us on that path, on that quest? Rituals, I suppose that you might use the word practices. Well, if we kind of know that we need to pay attention to our balance, the balance of our sort of head, heart, intelligences, how do we do that? What do we actually do? So if I'm honest. What do I do to be more in my heart centre, be more connected with people? What practice do I actually adopt? What does that call from me? And then finally, kind of, so that quest, exemplars, rituals, and then lastly, witness, which for me is just about saying, well, how do I actually live my life? You know, on a daily basis, what am I doing, and how does that stack up with what quest for wisdom might look like? So that's the sort of
it's very elegant, and as I'm sure we think about it, and people listening to us right now would think about it: quest, exemplars, rituals, witness, sense of mind, heart, body, running through that, balance through that.
Yeah.
So with that and this frame of your consciousness, conscience, context on the inner, compassion, courage, collaboration on the outer, here we are, Jane, in a really challenging moment around COVID-19, which threatens all of us, but it's unequally born. It's full of danger, but it's full of opportunity. I wonder, through the lens of this frame, what are you noticing in organisations? What are you seeing more of that you're thinking, I'm seeing chords of wisdom here in people's response, in organisations' response? What are you noticing? And I'd love to get into a conversation about, you know, what we might be seeing and what we'd like to amplify and encourage more as we look through this lens.
It's interesting, isn't it, Julian? Because I suppose, you know, wisdom, when you start exploring wisdom, one of the concepts you might quite quickly come across is there's a humility in wisdom, that, you know, there's so much we don't know, and actually the wise person would say, what don't we know as much as what do we know? And I'm conscious.
Well, perhaps that notion of not knowing is right at the core of this.
Yeah. I'm sitting in an office. I haven't been in an organisation other than going to, you know, physically going to the supermarket for a long several weeks now. But so I'm trusting what I'm hearing from people I'm connecting with, and what I'm noticing from, I have people in the house who are connecting with organisations in different ways. You know, there's a few things I would notice. I think if you think about the characteristics, there are some things that for me feel very strong. So I think when I listen to some of the people I'm talking to, that sense of compassion in organisations is quite strong for me, about the way some of the people I'm talking to who run teams or are involved in leading organisations are paying a great deal of attention to their people and how their people are, and you know, really listening to them, communicating, taking lots of time to do that, creating space. And, you know, I've had a few people say little things like, you know, cutting people some slack, taking care of people, really understanding what their needs are. And I think that's very strong for me, that sense of compassion is strong. I think the other element I think is quite strong is that, I mean, it's a kind of basic, but that sense of shared purpose is enormously strong at the moment, isn't it? That we have done, you know, given up on so many of the things we're used to doing because we have this sense of a core purpose that we're following. And I think that's a reminder of how powerful a shared purpose is. You know, it's a basic thing. And also the power of a shared purpose to enable people to do incredible things. So, I mean, the way that people have adapted and shifted ways of working and moved so quickly from one way of working to another is extraordinary, actually. And I think it reminds us just how capable and resilient we are. So I suppose in the end, as a characteristic, I would say that's the strength of conscience, that strength of when you have a strong purpose. It's incredible what can be achieved. So, you know, those are a couple of examples. I mean, I think, I don't know, my personal view, and I hope I'm right in this, really, is that I'm seeing probably more light than dark in the way organisations have risen. So I think I'm seeing, you know, generally more good things, but I'm sure there are things that are less good. And, you know, again, I hope I'm, you know, have some humility and I'm seeing only what I'm seeing.
So hearing you talk so strongly to underlying conscience, sense of what's important, deep down, shared purpose, leading to a capacity to adapt, more compassion. I mean, we're capable of amazing caring, but we're seeing more compassion, you're saying, and sense of shared purpose, and just resilience in adapting very quickly and very fast.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many examples of that. I just bumped into yesterday, a woman who leads a GP practice, and she said, we have completely changed the way we offer our services. And we've done things in the last 6 weeks that would have taken us 10, 12, 15 years.
Yeah.
And we've done it in 6 weeks.
Yeah.
That sense of adaptation. And there's also, isn't there, there's a relentlessness about organisational life as well, as we hear, don't we? You and I hear and others hear. It's hard, and it's really demanding a lot of us. And we're hearing that with the echoes of silence and calm and reflection and what's important. It's an interesting polarity, that, isn't it? Speed and slowing down that we're hearing.
Yes. Yeah.
And so as you look through this lens, as you look at those characteristics being particularly in relief, what to come to our core question of what we might ask of ourselves, from your perspective, what would you like organisations to ask of their wisdom in the coming months and years now, going forward? What's strong for you there in terms of wisdom, accessing their own wisdom as organisations?
Well, I think we're at a moment, aren't we, right now, like your example that you give of the GP practice, which is this an opportunity to think differently about things? So how do you stand back and say, well, how do we want things to be? We can make choices. We can choose to do things differently. In fact, as you give your example, that's achieved in 6 weeks what could have been achieved, what would have taken years to achieve in a different way. So I think that sort of, I would say right now there is that opportunity to stand back, and I'm sure lots of organisations are doing this. I hear it again with people I'm talking to saying, well, what do we want to keep from what we've changed? And that takes some conscious effort, doesn't it, that sort of consciousness, because there are choices to be made, and some of the particular things I would draw attention to are things I probably always have felt strongly about, but it's probably shone a light, hasn't it, on some of the inequalities on how we value different jobs and different people. I mean, I've been very conscious of the frontline workers on whom we depend. Some of the lowest paid workers are so crucial to our survival, aren't they? And I have quite a strong sense that we have been rather ignoring the pay inequalities for far too long, and that's something to pay attention to. I think there are bigger issues which are, we could do a whole different talk about things like the environment, but prior to COVID-19, the environmental agenda was really, really gathering momentum, I think, and this again has shone a light on what might be possible. When you stop people travelling, suddenly the air quality improves and so on. But we've got a choice to make there, haven't we, about to what extent do we want to stop travel? What's the balance we want to strike? I think on the working from home as well, same thing. I have mixed feelings. I'm sure we all do. The wonders of Zoom like this, but when I want to connect with people, so it's choices, making wise choices. And I would say, can we use this time to reflect on things and really do things differently? I think also it's been fascinating watching the state intervene as it did in the financial crisis. That what's possible when the state chooses to intervene is quite remarkable. That too.
Yeah, I and anyone who's listening to this are hearing you talk about what an opportunity to step back, pause, really decide on some choices around inequality and compassion and how we look after each other, shared purpose, sense of the environment, what's really important. And Jane, it's been wonderful to be in conversation with you. I mean, you're working so brilliantly on this and bringing it to the world, and you've given us in this short conversation your interest, the frames that you're offering the world around inner and outer, a frame for how we might all think about it. And there's so many things that we could be looking for now in terms of compassion and shared purpose. So if there was one thing in just 2 or 3 words that you'd want to leave us with about wise organizations and how we could encourage them to be even wiser in the next few years, what would you say to us?
That's a tricky one, but I think I would say I'd love to see the word wisdom in the organisational vocabulary, in the organisation.
Well, we can make that happen, Jane. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. What great fun to be in conversation with you. We're going to put this out. So I'm talking to those who are listening here. We're going to put this out shortly with a blog. And this is the beginning of a series of conversations, as Jane and I mentioned at the beginning. And next up, we have Alison Hogan, who's talking about living in the fertile void, the liminal space of holding this transition and how we can do that really well. And the wonderful Adam Wells is going to talk about the wisdom journey as exemplified by the pilgrimage across the Il Camino walking route. So 2 things to look out for in 2 weeks' time as we deepen our access to resources on wisdom. And thank you, Jane. It's been great to be in conversation with you, as ever. Thank you.
Bye-bye.